Well, welcome back, everyone. I think we had two very rousing presentations to get us started. Very excellent sort of introductions to some of the issues, questions, and solutions that Indigenous people are finding as they sort of seek to define what beyond reconciliation means in 21st century Canada. It's an exciting place, an exciting time. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to four of the most dynamic and exciting Indigenous leaders in Canada. They are people who in their own fields, their own regions of the country are extremely well known. They've done a remarkable job of transforming the face of Indigenous business and basically changing Canada sort of in the process. And they are the ones I think that have some excellent opportunities and strategies for reconciliation. The format we're going to use this afternoon or this evening is each one of our panelists is going to give a couple of minutes to give an opening presentation, introduce you to themselves, their organization, their activities, their sort of vision for Canada. I've got a series of questions that we have for all of them. They're not testing questions that I don't mark at the end. So there's no examination this time, Sean. You can stop worrying about that. But we are, I think, really blessed with having some remarkable people here to share their opinions and their thoughts with us. I'll introduce you to all four of them at the same time and then go to their turn. So Teresa Tate-Day, wonderful having you here.
Thank you.
A Wet'suwet'en First Nation leader. And if you haven't paid attention to Coastal Gas in the last little while, or if you have, you'll know Wet'suwet'en are at the forefront of this issue as well. But it's important for you to remember that the Wet'suwet'en people have actually been at the forefront of the Indigenous rights struggle for 40 years. Their leadership in court cases, but also in politics generally, has helped reshape Canada in some really exciting ways. It's a really fascinating place to live. She's a former director of the Native Programs of Legal Services of British Columbia and a founding member of the First Nation Major Project Coalition, which I think she's going to describe a little bit. And if you haven't heard of the First Nation Major Project Coalition, listen closely. It's very exciting because that coalition is redefining the place of First Nations people, Indigenous people in the national economy. Sitting next to her is Willy, a man who has been, in his very quiet way, actually he's not very quiet, but Sean has been at the forefront of sort of reimagining commercial reconciliation in Canada. He has personally a long history in the mining sector. He's from Northern Canada, which is why he's really good looking. He has helped reset the foundations of corporate community relations in some really exciting and dynamic ways. I've known Sean for 7 years or something like that. The work he's done in Cameco is actually world-class. Absolutely, the relationships he had with communities in northern Saskatchewan, just before he left Cameco to go and take over the rest of Canada, Sean actually negotiated a $2 billion 10-year agreement with 5 Indigenous communities in northern Saskatchewan that basically rewrote the foundations for what Indigenous communities could expect out of a real partnership. It's quite remarkable. And he is now leading one of the most impressive Aboriginal economic development corporations in the country. And again, if you're not all that familiar with the concept of Aboriginal economic development corporations, you should be. Many of these companies have annual revenues in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Several of them have assets of well over $1 billion, and they're just getting started. You ain't seen nothing yet in that regard. Karen Oguntoes is the actual CEO of First Nations LNG Alliance. It's a society established by First Nations in support of responsible LNG development in British Columbia, a former chief of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation. I think the Wet'suwet'en are sort of like the Saskatchewan of First Nations people, sort of taking over control and providing leadership as we go along. What's really interesting about Karen's work and the work of her colleagues at First Nations LNG is that they got that organization started at a time when people just assumed that Indigenous Canadians were opposed to resource development and they were going to stop everything in its tracks. And unless you haven't noticed the last little while, there's been some pretty impressive announcements. Coastal LNG is a really impressive example. The Squamish First Nation has reached an agreement as well, and there's many others under development, so great to have you here. And Stephen Buffalo, a really interesting fellow from the Samson Cree Nation. His official title is President and CEO of the Indian Resource Council of Canada. His more important title is I think he's the Vice President or President of the Notre Dame Hounds National Alumni Association, a graduate of Alden Murray College and a former hockey coach. Stephen is in the process with his colleagues at Indian Resource Council of transforming, literally turning on its head, the understanding of the Indigenous role in the natural resource economy. And to give Stephen and his colleagues real credit, because they've done an amazing job. You know, 5 years ago, we sort of had vague notions that IRC was out there doing some things. And last year, when Trans Mountain Pipeline was purchased, and Stephen and a few others gave a press conference, and they sort of said, we'd like to think about maybe buying this and taking it, running it as an Indigenous organization. The response in Canada was not incredulity. The response in Canada was, what a neat idea. So Stephen's played a huge role in that. So we're going to go down in order. You're first, young lady, if you go first. And we'll go down here, a couple of minutes each one, and then a couple of questions, and then we'll wrap up our evening. So off you go, Teresa.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here amongst distinguished members of the MLA and Indigenous people, Haisla. I want to recognize the Algonquin Indigenous people here, the lands that we are on. And I'd like to say that I'm privileged because here in Ontario, it was the first place where we made a treaty with Canada, and it was called the Two-Row Wampum Belt. And there we started the discussions about what we wanted as Indigenous people. We wanted to live side by side with our autonomy, our laws, our language, our culture, our sovereignty. And over the years, you've heard the dissemination of our people through colonization. And it's been a struggle for Indigenous people to gain foothold in the economics. I want to talk about how that's going to, how we can move ahead, and you've heard some good solutions about that. My involvement is with the Major Projects Coalition as one of the members when we first began in 2014. There was only a few people with the idea that we realized that we needed to have equity stake in major projects before we could ever move our communities out of poverty. Since colonization, we have been managing poverty, and we've never had an opportunity to get out of poverty. And as you know, the Delgamuukw-Gisdewe decision of the Wet'suwet'en and the Gitxsan put forward the recognition when the courts went to, when the Supreme Court decision came down under that, they recognized that there were Indigenous Aboriginal rights. And it's about really making those rights come alive. And we couldn't do it because the Delgamuukw-Gisdewe decision recognized accommodation and consultation. And that was the extent of it. And everybody moved ahead with consultation and accommodation and gained benefits and started to roll out the Indigenous language and the way we wanted to move forward. So when we realized that that wasn't good enough, because we were still taking pennies on the dollar, and we were not in control of our lives in the communities, and we did not have a way to get out of under the Indian Act and to deal with the colonial oppression that of our people have suffered. So a group of people like Jerry St. Germain, Harold Calla, Nilo Edwards, Indigenous people came together and said the only way we're going to change the landscape is to have equity stake in these major projects. And then we had an opportunity to do that with Pacific Trails Pipeline, where there was a 30% equity stake that we as Indigenous people could have. The only barrier is that we were not able to get a loan guarantee. We could go to the bank, but it would not have provided any revenue because of the high interest rate. So we formed a coalition of Indigenous people who believe that standing together as Indigenous people, as non-Indigenous people, you are vital to us because you need to be part of our allies You need to be part of this discussion, because the only way that Indigenous people can get out of poverty is having an equity in their own resources on the land, whether it be trees or pipelines or mining or what have you. When my elders back in the day, when non-Indigenous people came and government was formed, they said, all we want is 1 cent per tree. And we never got 1 cent today, nothing. And in order to change that landscape, I would, if you're parliamentarians here, influential people here, I would urge you to look at how do we support Indigenous change by providing that the allyship that is needed. What can we do to reconcile? We heard about the issues within my community. When you look into my community, you realize that there is colonial oppression live and well, and that there's intergenerational oppression, internalized racism within the community that we as Indigenous people have to deal with. That's an internal matter. And sometimes when we want to be part of the economy, but sometimes we have to grow our people at the community level in order to do that. And there again, we're going to need the support of the federal and provincial government to help us get out of poverty. The main issue for us as Wet'suwet'en people is that we have 6 bands. We have an area from Burns Lake to Hazelton, and we have hereditary chiefs, of which I am one. And so these two things, when you recognize that government has always put the Indian Act first, and you recognize that Indigenous, like the owners of the land, were not part of that conversation. So we want to have that ability to be part of that conversation. We do not have a governance system that is inclusive of our entire nation. And so as a result, you have conflict. And that's one of the things I think that we need to resolve at our community level. The view of the Major Projects Coalition and its strength, it comes from the 50 members that are part of it now. We believe that in order to move forward as Indigenous people, we need to have that equity partnership stake in those projects. And that's what we've been moving towards. There are projects underway or being thought about, the transmission line that is going to support the LNG project from Prince George to Kitimat. We want to own that as Indigenous people. And so we want to move forward with that project, and so that it will support that. We want to be able to look after the environment as we go forward. The Kenny Dam water release project is a project that was put into place in 1953 or something. And that displaced the community, and it displaced, all the graves came floating up from that community. And there was never any reconciliation around that. And so the Major Projects Coalition, as part of the reconciliation, is working with the people that are attached to the land so that we can revitalize the water. We can get a benefit from a hydroelectric project as Indigenous people. And when we first began, I must say that this language about ownership was a really hard lesson, for something to take. Like when I saw the community and the people in that room, there was no language about ownership or equity stake. It was all impact benefit agreements, and we were still in poverty, and we were still taking peanuts and living in that world. So we realized that it's about moving money around in the government. I mean, if you are going to support us by providing a loan guarantee. And we can be self-governing as we wanted to in the beginning with the two-row wampum belt, to be ourselves as Indigenous people. That is where we are still at today. We want to move forward in that direction, to be able to be self-governing and have an equity and have positions in the community. And I want to say more, but I feel like I'm taking too much time. Is that right? I believe that we, as Canadians, I think it's about educating. It's about working together. It's becoming allies with us as Indigenous people. And it's about listening and learning and doing our jobs to move us out of poverty as Indigenous people. And the Major Projects Coalition is one of the leading organizations that is looking towards the future. And what is it going to look like in the future? It's going to look like something like the Haisla Nation, I hope, that we will be able to use the resources that we have and share those resources with other Canadians. But we want to benefit because historically, our Indian people have been oppressed, and we need to get out of that. And work has to happen at the community level, at the provincial level, at the national level, in order for that to change. That's what I think. That's good.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Teresa. That was great. Sean, over to you.
Thanks, Ken. Pleasure to be here tonight. I share Teresa's comments, respect that we're on Algonquin unceded territory. I am overwhelmed that we're in the Canadian War Museum, and understanding that Canadian World War II vets, when they came home, were treated different than their fellow vets. And that created a wave in this country that enshrined Indigenous rights within the Constitution, which started a wave of Supreme Court decisions that all of us, as the next generation of Indigenous people, are allowed to build off of. So I pay respect to those former leaders, those former agitators, those former civil disobedience masters, and our chiefs for setting the table for us moving forward. Me personally, I'm born in Inuvik to a Dennisuthlene mother and a socially liberal dad who wanted to change the world. And that's my context, as I grew up in a house talking about Indigenous inclusion and everything. My father was a trendsetter in the late 1970s by hiring 300 Native people at a uranium mine in northern Saskatchewan. He later went on to build the Diavik mine, Echo Bay mines, with a strong focus of Indigenous inclusion, with my Dennisuthlene mother from the Mercady family guiding him along the way. My mother was one of the first Indigenous women in the Bank of Montreal's Aboriginal banking program. So she was always striving to get her education. This is a woman that was taken from her family when she was 2 months old and put into foster care and in residential school. But she removed any hurdle in her path just to get her education. So she drove me to get to further education, but also further drive economic value for our communities. So I'm lucky enough to work for the English River First Nation. That's whose logo I wear today. I'm lucky enough to be able to bridge in both worlds. We have a group of elders and community leaders in northern Saskatchewan that for the last 35 years has understood that you cannot move forward with government payments and social assistance alone, and that they were blessed with the world's highest grade uranium deposits in the earth in their backyard. So as Blaine said earlier, they learned not to trust the environmentalists because they had a thriving fur trading economy that was taken from them, from Southerners. So when these same people came up and said, you don't want to deal with uranium, they looked at them with distrust and they said, if we're involved with the environmental monitoring of these projects, if we're involved in the permitting of these projects, if we're involved in the decommissioning and reclamation of these projects, if we can strive to get as much value out of these projects as possible, including workforce development, including business development, including community investment, we will support it. So we have been strong supporters, English River have been strong supporters of taking the uranium out of English River Traditional Territory and providing power to the world. 1 in every 7 homes in the United States is powered from uranium from English River Territory. During the cold snap 2 weeks ago in Ontario, the nuclear power plants were running at 40% capacity, and they were sharing power into the Quebec grid on hydro alone. All that uranium comes from English River Traditional Territory. We have 160 band members working at our peak. At Nedhe, I have elders that are bullish on economy, almost sometimes too bullish. We have a strong industrial sector. They're so proud of their industrial sector, we operate the only 100% owned mechanical piping electrical instrumentation contractor. They were so stubborn not to do a joint venture that they kept building and building and building capacity over time because they wanted to do what's right for their community. Trust me, it's a great value proposition now as I go around and work with other First Nations at opening up new opportunities with places like Bruce Power and with large construction companies coast to coast to coast. We also got involved in underground mining. We also are involved in now UAV or drone technology because it gives our young people something else to do. They can drive drones on tablets and monitor barren land and woodland caribou, monitor wildfires, monitor effluent lines. And the sky's the limit on this new technology. We have another division that the community and elders purchased 200 acres of land adjacent to Saskatoon. 15,000 cars pass by us daily. We operate the busiest petro-can in the province. We sell the most tobacco in the province to First Nation customers with good rebates. We just won 3 cannabis stores in Saskatchewan, so we're full market on cannabis, tobacco. We're even looking to get into the wine distribution side, so we have all the sins covered. We started using our own source revenue to start to purchase blue chip assets. So we purchased a steel fabrication company that does a lot of work in the oil sands and the potash industry. We bought a strategy communications marketing firm. And just last month, we opened up our first office in Ottawa. So it's now the first First Nation-driven government relations lobby. Because First Nations are here lobbying all the time, might as well have somebody that speaks their language representing them. We own 20% of a catering housekeeping company. So we own a trucking company. Our plans are to use 5,300 acres of land for more commercial development. So I am looking for patient money. Who's ever out there looking at private equity? We are looking for patient money to develop new industrial and commercial opportunities around Saskatchewan. We've gotten into the renewable power space and we're engaged with the federal government and provincial governments on inclusion within their clean energy strategies. We are big on nation-to-nation partnerships. So we're owned by the First Nation, 100%. Our value proposition is a little different than your normal companies, some of you might not know. Our ROI is driven not just by profit, but also employment of Indigenous people. We think that adds value to the country as a whole. We think that hiring somebody who's currently on social assistance and moving them into a wage-based economy, trust me, we all know that Indigenous people spend money. We don't put it away and save it. We help our families out. We go usually buy a new Ford truck, might buy some furniture. We are multipliers on the GDP in this country. So I'm happy to share our thoughts on the next steps moving forward. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Sean. Karen, over to you.
Okay. First, I want to acknowledge the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Thank you for allowing us to conduct our business on your territory. In addition, Misaikyo to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for inviting me to be on this panel, Ken Coates and David Crowley? Brian, sorry. I also wanted to acknowledge that over 4,000 First Nations men and women served in each of the First and Second World Wars, numbers that were proportionally equivalent to enrollment from the country as a whole. So that's quite significant, and to add to what he said about how they were treated differently. So being here, sort of, you can't help but think about those things. I am Karen Ogan Taves. I'm a Skyzip. That means I'm a child of a hereditary chief Nakwaon. I'm here with my fellow Wet'suwet'en Tsekeza. I have Gitsan and Wet'suwet'en ancestry. I belong to the House of Spokes from the Gadimden Bear Clan. So if you think about the Wet'suwet'en territory, my roots come from the Hagwilgat area, but I reside, or my home community is in Burns Lake. So we've traveled quite a ways to be in the whole Wet'suwet'en territory. I have 25 years plus of social work experience within Indigenous communities in the north of BC. I work the front lines in family preservation, life skills programs, managing, directing, and overhauled the approach of program delivery services to be more proactive in early intervention. I'm also the former chief of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation. During that time, we've developed our natural resources, our economic development programs, because those are the keys and ways forward for our communities. We negotiated agreements with government and industry in LNG. I was a forerunner in promoting LNG, and I'm founder of the First Nations LNG Alliance. We support responsible resource development and promote education and awareness through various social media channels. We participate in panels and guest speaking to promote our cause, as it is for the people and about the people and increasing their quality of life. So the theme of this evening is about beyond reconciliation. That is a huge concept in relation to Indigenous people of Canada. First, we need to get to true reconciliation so we can look beyond reconciliation. I've had to Google the definition of reconciliation in Canada, and this is what Google had told me. Indigenous and non-Indigenous reconciliation in Canada is not only about the legacy of residential schools. It is a multifaceted process that restores lands, economic self-sufficiency, and political jurisdiction to First Nations, and develops respectful and just relationships between First Nations and Canada. Beyond reconciliation to me means that our lands will be restored. Nations across Canada will economically be self-sufficient, and First Nations will have political jurisdiction. And we will have respectful and just relationships between First Nations and Canada. One of the major developments in our community and nation is that we were in the eye of the storm. Being Wet'suwet'en, being Gadimden, being a former chief who signed agreements with government and industry. In a romanticized approach, we looked like the villain in this story. The opposing narrative was very loud and gained support throughout Canada and internationally. But one thing was never mentioned, and that was our people, who continue to live in poverty. We have boiled water advisories. We have high rates of people on social assistance, high unemployment rates. Violence against women continues to escalate. There is no plan in place from the opposition on these issues. But the Indian Act chiefs are doing their best to deal with these issues as proactive as possible. When I reflect on all of these issues that have happened since January 7th, the good that has come out of this all is that the rest of the Canadian society is being educated on who we are as Indigenous people of Canada. What is an elected chief and what is a hereditary chief? How do their roles work together and how are they distinct in each of the communities that have traditional systems in place? A crash course on the legalities on the situation. What does Delgamuukw really mean? What does the Chilcotin court case mean to us? And what are the next steps for us? In my view, we must come together in a respectful way and hash out our differences. The guiding principles of this hashing out is the people, the clan members, and their best interest along with the traditional territories. If we had to make a choice between people and the land, who would you choose, or what would you choose? Think about that. Think about your choice that you're making. I personally would choose the people. Each of us are not replaceable as an individual. Our people need healing. When our people are whole, we can continue to be the stewards of the land. Who we are as people and what we do are two distinct things. A positive, constructive, and forward-looking vision for our future is this. Canada begins to take responsibility and work with each of the communities in relation to true reconciliation when it comes to land, economic self-sufficiency, and governance. When the Indigenous people are on the same page in terms of what we want to see our people flourishing mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. I find it ironic that Canada is named the second best country in the world, second to Switzerland. When we see the results of the quality of life for our people increased, then we can truly say we are the second best country to live in. Like my colleague has said, equity ownership in major projects in relation to resource development is the way to go. It will provide long-term self-sustaining economies for Indigenous people. I'll leave you with this quote from Josh Larson. We must recognize before we can reconcile, especially in instances where we are too blinded by privilege, comfort, and tradition to even notice that reconciliation is needed. Thank you. Misahikyo.
Thanks very much, Karen. Appreciate that. Stephen.
Umano tamtik. Nanaska mon mamohtawe mau miagiska nots agwa tipskak. Ninuhte nanaska mauna kapix kestamagya. Maskuchi siknupsiko pa jetnia. Agwa nanaska mon kakya we petotieg. Tapoy ayman ne yawi wen kakyo. First off, I want to thank Creator for this beautiful day. I want to thank our elder for our prayer. Prayer is important, spirituality is important, and I need the everyday Canadian to understand when we say we're connected to the land, it's because we're connected to God, the Creator. I'm Stephen Buffalo from Samson, is what I said. And also I asked if anyone knew what the score in the Flames game was. But I am from Samson in Musquecheese, formerly known as Hobima. I've been with the Indian Resource Council for the last 5 years. And it's still a continuous learning experience. I want to acknowledge the chiefs, the leaders, the MPs, and anyone else that has a big checkbook that can help Indian Resource Council. But, in all seriousness, the Indian Resource Council has been around since the early 80s. And part of it was because of one of my community, Samson Cree Nation. The oil and gas industry has been definitely something that we benefited from as a people. But with that enormous wealth in our, as the exploration came, we were given royalties because we had one of the biggest oil and gas plays, the Bonnie Doon Pool near Pigeon Lake. And our people weren't ready for it. Our people weren't ready for the industry itself. We were just merely royalty collectors, and decisions were made without our knowledge by not only industry but government. Hence, the Indian Resource Council came about in that time. My colleague Larry has been with IRC since day 3, back in the day. And you know what, he's seen a lot of change. But we advocate for the oil and gas producing nations that are in Western Canada primarily. There's approximately about 130 First Nations that have oil and gas potential and are currently producing it and have the potential to produce. So we've been advocating for the last, well, since I've been there 5 years, to ensure that, one, we're modernizing the Indian Oil and Gas Act. And it's a long process, and it's painful. You wanna, it's like sitting at the waiting room at the hospital. You know, it's not fun, but we're working with Indian Oil and Gas Canada on modernizing these regulations. So I'm pleased to say that, you know, it's in the second phase of the Gazette process, and hopefully it should be enforceable in law by this fall coming up. So, you know, it was our people sitting at the table with Indian Oil and Gas Canada to ensure that our rights are protected, that our interests are protected. You know, and that's something that the government of Canada and the provinces of where you come from can learn from. It is a liberal document back in 1996 that was signed by the minister of the day, Ron Irwin, with our board leadership on creating an institution for the transition that our people can manage the resources prudently and in our best interests. But that has been delayed. It's been delayed because of not only ourselves not really understanding still what we're doing, but government kind of got in the way. But going forward, there's some optimism. Because as we met today with some officials from the Department of Indian Affairs, they want to see the transition happen. And they've been supportive in that way. Most recently, you know, I think it was Chief Wilson that said, if a turtle wants to move forward, he has to stick his neck out. So I said, yeah, we need to buy the pipeline. Our communities benefit from the natural resource sector, oil and gas. We've come to terms with how it's extracted. And definitely we work hard to ensure that we can repatriate those lands. And that's what's happening now. We're seeing the repatriation of some of our communities, and we're asking for help to ensure that we get the pipes out of the ground, that we can turn some of the lands used that were leased by industry back into something that is usable. Our populations are growing. And currently, right now, where I'm from in Pigeon Lake, there's a housing development that we're planning for, but are stopped because there's still pipes in the ground from 1970. So we have to work together on, you know, fixing the planet. It's been exciting, and this government has given some optimism to our people. But saying that, sometimes we're our own worst enemy. You know, our people, some of our people have been kind of misguided. And it's just our job to continue to build that capacity on understanding this industry. You know, I've been ridiculed, I've been called everything under the sun, and it's our own people that are doing it, because the vision that I see with this pipeline, and we put forward, like, to say that we want to buy the Trans Mountain Pipeline, because now I'm an earth killer. Now I don't care about the environment. But I'm happy to say that our regulations in Canada, compared to anyone else in the world, is world class. The monitoring, the protection, it's there. And if we own it, and if we're monitoring it, I guarantee you we'll do our best job, because our connection to the earth. It's hard to find that balance, and that's what we're looking for, the balance of environmental protection and the balance of economic development. You've heard it too many times today. Our communities are poor. And right now, you see a kind of two sides of the scale. You have the have-nots and you have the haves. Not everyone can do uranium mining. Not everyone can get into the tobacco industry. Not everyone can have a casino. And it's fortunate that some of these bands that have signed on, not only with TMX, but with the LNG, that they see some prosperity. You know, the biggest struggle that I have is that this Indian Act is not good for us. I have a good friend of mine, Michael Binion from the Modern Miracle Network, and he used to be at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And he told me, he said, you know what, this Indian Act is no good. We got to get rid of it. And I said, tell me more. He said, you guys are set up to fail. And that's what it is. I'm here with former Chief Delbert Wapass. He was unable to attend tonight, but he challenged the government, said, I'm done managing your poverty. You do it. So you know, they were put in a third-party situation. You know what, some of us want to move away from that. And again, you know, on the surface, everyone looks at Stephen Buffalo that said he wants to buy the pipeline. I do not want to be a pipeline owner. I want to find a way so our people can get out of poverty. We can find that balance. We can fix those water issues. We can deal with education issues. And the only way we can do that right now that I can think of is that we need money. You know, and it's as radical as that sounds, it needs to happen. You know, because we can't continue like this. You know, like I said, our populations are growing. Our people are moving to the cities. And now you're seeing problems with, you know, I fear for my daughter, I fear for my sisters. Indigenous women, there's been an attack on them for some reason. And it's hard because they have to be providers. In our communities, the women are powerful. They have to be providers for their children, the children that we have. So they go out and they go to these cities. And sometimes bad things happen. But we got to create that hope. And the only way we can create that hope is we get involved in these infrastructure projects. You know, it's really difficult when I see some people in the room here that have told me no, or have walked away from ideas that I had before. And, you know, it's not my ideas. You know, these are ideas that I got by consensus from my board, and these people on our board are the leaders of their communities. And they want to find a way. You know, when I have a chief sitting on my board, I have to ask him for 1 hour at least, give me an hour of your time, where we can talk about these plays and where we can position ourselves as Indigenous people. In that hour, he's still looking at his phone. He's getting a phone call about 100 different things that he has to take back in his community. So it's really difficult. But, you know, moving forward, it's exciting to see industry reaching out. Just recently, I had a nice meeting with Canadian Natural Resources. And a good friend of mine, Bill Clapperton, said, how can we help? Let's work together. And that's tremendous. We had the Pipeline Gridlock Conference back in 2016. And it's kind of funny. The first day, one side of the room was industry and non-Indigenous. The other side was our Indigenous leaders. It looked like a really bad sock hop. But decisions were made there to try to move forward on this whole issue. So just recently, 3 weeks ago, we had the Indigenous Energy Summit. And we had over 450 people come through the door and listen. We had some great messages from industry. We had great messages from Indigenous leaders. And we listened to 4 policies on financing models that might work on how we can participate with the Trans Mountain. So that's positive. And the big thing that my father told me was when he was chief, and this was probably over 8 years ago, he said, when industry would come and speak, they would send the poster boy Indigenous guy or girl. And at our conference, we had the president and CEOs. And that says a lot. That says there's some recognition that we need each other. You know, Chief Willy Littlechild, he's kind of like my other dad. He spoke at the Canadian Energy Executive Association, and he left them with this. He said, you remember playing on the railroad tracks and you're trying to balance and walk on it? And then you figure it out. You feel held hands. And she's balancing on that track and I'm balancing on this track. We can go a lot further together. So that's what we're going to do.
Well, those were magnificent presentations by all four of you, and I'm a bit aware that we're sort of running close to the end of time. So I'm going to ask you the one Emily question we always ask. The Macdonald-Laurier Institute is a policy institute. So what I want you to think of is if you could change one element in Indigenous policy in Canada, what would it be? I know Stephen well enough to know he's got 14 pages of element things that he wants to write. But Stephen, one element, start with the top one.
When it comes to Indigenous policy, I think the first thing my Uncle Joe Dion says, let's kill the lawyers. No, just kidding. Just kidding.
The Macdonald Institute does not support that regularly. Go ahead, Stephen.
Well, you know what works at our joint technical committee table is that our First Nation technicians, not necessarily leaders, but our technicians are at the table when you're creating those policies. To me, that's the start of something different. You know, and it works at the Indian Resource Council with the Indian Oil and Gas Act, and I think that's something that the government can learn and utilize.
Excellent, thanks. Karen, your thought?
I've had to really think about this question, and it's a well thought out question. And I may step on people's toes as I say this, but I'm going to say it because you're asking. It is actually very difficult to identify the Indigenous policy environment in Canada, unless maybe it is inconsistency and chaos. Perhaps the first step would be to sit down and develop an honest, practical, and contemporary policy framework at every level, federal, provincial, and Indigenous. One thing that might help is to limit the money and political attention poured into large umbrella organizations like the AFN and UBCIC, and instead put the funding and political priority on smaller, ad hoc collectives that are dealing with specific initiatives, such as LNG or oil, at the local, regional, or project level. Larger organizations could still be helpful dealing with the federal and provincial governments in social programs such as health, language, and education. But they are not helpful in land and resource issues, culture, or specific conflict situations. Another is to focus more on the present and the future than on past grievances. It's not entirely clear what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission intended by reconciliation, but it has largely become an exercise in venting, finger-pointing, and historical second-guessing. Those important historical points have been made. And it is time to start resolving problems through specific concepts such as economic reconciliation.
Thank you. Teresa?
Policy change for government, I believe, requires, from the top level, a recognition of Aboriginal rights and title, that Indigenous people have sovereignty, particularly in Canada, and particularly in BC, and where policy change is needed is that recognition, and following that is the recognition that in order to do that, we need to have economic ability to manage our resources and to become full equity players with the managing our resources from our traditional territories. And if there was a policy change in government, it would have to be the devolution, really, of the Indian Act so that Indigenous people can start living outside of poverty and start creating their own wealth. And we believe that this can happen in the future with the support of government and recognition of our rights and title. We should be able to find ways to come out of what we are living in right now is poverty. And that includes a recognition that our nations need to come together to govern ourselves. When we have hereditaries and electeds, we have been living under that system for a long time, where those two do not hold equal power in the eyes of the government. So that policy change will have to recognize the landscape of Indigenous nations. And we're not talking just about on reserve, I'm talking about developing policies within the nation itself so that we can recognize ourselves, so that we can come out of that poverty. And it's going to take a few years for us as Indigenous people to bring our people out of what was colonial oppression. And I think that recognition of how Indigenous people have been oppressed over the 150 years in our country is a step forward. And I don't see this now within the Canadian government system. They do not allow us Indigenous people to manage ourselves. They don't allow us to make our own decisions. And the Indian Act we're subjected to. And until we get out of the Indian Act and we are self-sufficient and self-governing, then I think that is the future for us as Indigenous people.
Thank you very much. Sean.
The one we haven't discussed about is Indigenous business itself and the power that brings communities. And I look at the great strides LNG is making. And one day the Haisla First Nation is going to want to diversify. Like all First Nations that get into business, we thank Creator for the opportunities that we are bounded by within our traditional territories. But we want to diversify. Our elders wanted to create business, and we want to move into other markets and work with other nations, not just in Canada, but around the globe. You look at companies like Cameco, who were the trendsetters in the late 70s. You look at what Rio Tinto's done, what Voisey Bay's done. You know, right now, the Clecho are opening up the ice road to the diamond mines. Employs 70 Clecho people. You've got the Nunatsiavut group of companies doing all the shipping for the Voisey Bay iron ore mines. You got the Nunavut Inuit in northern Quebec supporting the Raglan mine. You know, you've heard our story, what we do, Fort McKay and Athabasca Chip in oil sands. The breadth and depth of Indigenous business is growing. And there's one player who is absent from this whole discussion, and that's the federal government. It doesn't matter if it's conservative or liberal. Over the last 10 years, they procure $12 to $14 billion worth of goods and services. 0.5% goes to Indigenous entities. 0.5%. How can you create a middle class? We're not even allowed to bid on building an elder center in our home community because it's a race to the bottom. You know, we run a $60 million construction company that works in the nuclear industry, just signed a big deal with Bruce Power. Yet we can't win a construction of an elder facility in our home First Nation. We ask why. It's like, wow, you guys are overbid because we pay our people a living wage. There's no place to talk about employing 50% Indigenous people. There's no place to talk about when you employ and break the cycle of social welfare, that those people's kids, that individual now going to work, that people's kids wants to do better than their parents. They want to get education. You've seen it time and time again by the multiplier. So I would urge the federal government to actually look at us as a value add. That the money we move people from social assistance into wage-based economies is a multiplier for generations. Plus, all the money stays in the country. You know, you look at the Department of Defense and the money they spend. You know, imagine investing that in Indigenous actives, Indigenous entrepreneurs. It's all staying in Canada. So I would challenge the federal government to start putting targets. And this is something my friend JP and I have been on for 3 years. And the basic understanding is that people don't know the breadth and depth of Indigenous business in this country and the risks they're taking, the security they're doing, the safety they're performing at. And really, I want to be bullish on Indigenous business because I want to come back here in 20 years and Indigenous business is the largest contributor to the GDP in this country. And we're tapping in to the flood of young Indigenous people come out of schools right now because they want to come work for us. I'm sorry, they want to work for other Indigenous people. So I welcome any conversation with any other nation to come join us, First Nation Project Management Organization, and I challenge the parliamentarians in the room to look at the value proposition around federal procurement.
Okay, thank you. We have started a conversation that we could go on forever, and I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I do want to sort of pick up, if you don't mind, I could pick up on all the comments. You're just so wonderful people. Sean's comment at the end about procurement is kind of an interesting one. You think, what would have happened if Aboriginal people had the same percentage of government procurement money as they have as the population? Let's just pick a number of 5%. You would transform communities overnight. It would be, but here's the thing that people say, they whisper this. I don't think they say it to First Nations very often. The whisper is, it's too bad they didn't have enough companies that could do this. And imagine if we actually got to 5%. Well, you haven't got enough companies to do the construction or to do the services or to provide all these kinds of things. Well, I can officially say as a scholar, hogwash. Aboriginal communities have the capacity today to take up to 5% of the government procurement capacity. They could do it now. Research by the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business has shown this very conclusively. This is a barrier that doesn't exist. Right? And imagine if we could actually do that one thing, which we do in a whole bunch of areas. Our defense strategy is all based around procurement, local procurement, and things of that sort. This has been a wonderful conversation the whole evening. Crystal, fantastic, absolutely wonderful. Blaine, wonderful presentation. It's been just terrific. The four of you, I've known you all in different contexts. You're fabulous. And the vision you have here today is, I think, an important one. I think a couple of the comments came out here, and this is something we have to give the current government a lot of credit for because it's something they're not talking about very loudly. They're engaged in a process with the Assembly of First Nation and other Indigenous groups, what I describe as the co-production of policy. They are not producing policy in a vacuum and then popping it out for the country as a whole. They're starting a process of that consultation, and that's great news. All four people here have talked about the fact that they have good non-Aboriginal partners, that this is not something that's starting from scratch. That whether it's Cameco, whether it's Fortis in Ontario that's doing some wonderful financing of Indigenous projects in the forest industry, the mining sector, oil and gas. Oil and gas companies have hundreds of joint ventures, hundreds of them, worth tens and hundreds of millions of dollars a year. They have found partners in the non-Aboriginal community, the general Canadian business community, which is absolutely fabulous. Partnership requires people on both sides. And the good news is we are having more of those. And they're learning from the Camecos of the world. And they're learning from the good partners that are coming out with LNG Canada and things of that sort. I hope as you sort of reflect on this, I hope you reflect a lot on this, because there's been a ton of really powerful messages, but do recognize these are passionate people, they're optimistic people. They also will go back to communities that will challenge that optimism on a daily basis. It is not easy to come here and sit in a largely non-Indigenous audience and talk about hope and opportunity and optimism and the great future that lies ahead, and then go back home. Stephen mentioned really quickly, because this is something I've seen dozens and dozens of times, of the chief who's having a conversation about buying Trans Mountain Pipeline, and those texts and phone calls that are coming in, it's a teenage suicide. It's a house that just burned down. It's a contract that they were counting on that just was dismissed because it didn't tick all the right boxes. There's a whole series of those things that chiefs and councillors and business leaders have to deal with on a daily basis that fortunately very few of the non-Aboriginal people have to deal with in the same sort of way. I love the passion. I love the optimism that I see here. It's just absolutely fascinating. But I'll leave with this. There's one theme that's gone through this that I think we hope you'll take out and scream from the mountaintops, because people don't hear this often enough. The goal is to end poverty. The goal of Indigenous rights movement from the 1960s has been to end welfare dependency. You know, the reliance on government money was not something Indigenous people sought. It was something that, with a good heart and good expectations, governments across Canada sort of brought in and said, aren't you lucky, we're going to buy you a house and put you on a reserve. That was not something First Nations wanted to see. Ending poverty, setting up independent business operations, absolutely fabulous. So as I end tonight, just on behalf of Brian Lee Crowley and the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, I want to thank all of our speakers. They were fabulous. Around the place you've seen MLI staff all running around. This didn't all happen today. It happened over many months, and I appreciate that. Brian Lee Crowley, if you don't know already, is I think Canada's leading public policy thinker, a brilliant individual who believes passionately that Canada can do better, but even more strongly insists that it must do better. And coming with reconciliation, moving beyond reconciliation with Indigenous peoples is part of that. I must recognize, and again, the sponsors, they really make this all possible. LNG Canada, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, Canadian Natural Resources, the National Bank, TransCanada, IPEX, Canadian War Museum, Imperial, iPolitics, Cement Association of Canada, 360 Public Affairs, Canadian Gas Association, and the Modern Miracle Network. So I finish up by saying Macdonald-Laurier Institute greatly appreciates your support for our institution, for the work that we try to do in the public policy space. But more than anything else, we appreciate your help in basically boosting the move toward reconciliation and beyond. If we had this conversation 10 years ago, you would not have heard the things we heard from our 6 speakers today. The transformation has been absolutely stunning. I'm not officially an elder. Blaine and I were talking about this. He's younger than I am. And he said, I can see when I'm going to be an elder soon. And he was staring at me. I grew up in Whitehurst in the 1960s. I'll give you one example. We had segregation in the movie theater, where Aboriginal people had to go sit in a different part of the theater from non-Aboriginal people. That wasn't 100 years ago. It's sort of getting close, but this is 1960s. The sort of institutionalized, localized racism that Indigenous people grew up with. In my high school, we had 30% of the kids that started off in grade 8 were Aboriginal. We had maybe 2 or 3% that graduated from grade 12, and most in the tech stream. These are the realities of only 40 or 50 years ago. And now, even over the last 10 years, it has been such a profound change. And I hope you will celebrate that, but I also hope you'll be part of the change to make this even better. Canada is a great country, but it's not perfect. We cannot allow that poverty to exist for Indigenous peoples, and only by empowering them and giving them economic development opportunities, equity possibilities, freeing the power and the passion of these 6 people you heard tonight, what a great country we can be if we actually get beyond reconciliation. Thank you, everybody, for a great evening.